Welcome to Tilly's Trans Tuesdays. August is still Trans History Month, and this week our topic is Trans History 2, Examples of Trans People in History. Hi, I'm Tilly Bridges, your host, and I'm joined by my writing partner, my best friend, my wife, our token cis representation, the only lady in history who helped me change my history, Susan Bridges.
Hello.
That was a mouthful. I barely got that out.
But you did it.
Yes, I did.
Good job.
Thank you. Our returning guest is Nico Mara-McKay, a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada-funded PhD student at the University of Toronto in history with a collaborative specialization in sexual diversity studies. The research focuses on non-normative gender expressions in late medieval France. Welcome back, Nico.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I wanted to ask what it was about medieval France that drew you in. Why is that what you chose to focus on?
Honestly, the language made it easier. I'm Canadian, so
yeah,
you learn English and, well, in school, if you're Anglophone, you learn French growing up in school. And so I had sort of a background in that, so that helped with some of the being able to read some of the sources or approaching them somewhat. French is quite different in that period, but
yeah,
it's easier than learning an entirely different language.
Sure.
That's sort of one of the things that made me interested in that area. Also, the fact that there's sources there. I did my master's on medieval surgical texts, which also made it an attractive area to continue the research that I have sort of done in that area already.
So is there something specifically that draws you to the medieval era that you've always been fascinated by, or what is it about that you're like, yes, this is where I want to go?
Yeah, I think it's part of it is because this is, I think, where sort of what gets to be called Western ideas of gender and sexuality start to get defined. You get the invention of things like sodomy. You get the invention of codified gender rules and demarcations of who's supposed to do what in marriage, according to the church fathers and things, not just the church fathers, but this is starting to be argued by theologians and things. So you get sort of this settling of what these things are supposed to be. Heavy air quotes.
Yeah.
On these. So that kind of makes it an interesting area of study for me.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know. I don't know. I'm not super into history like that. I didn't know that was really where a lot of that stuff sort of started or it was coming about. And that is fascinating.
Every historian kind of has their own take on this. So as somebody who studies, ancient Greece would say, this is where it comes from. so some of there's a long history, but this is where I think it gets codified. So don't take that as necessarily universal truth of that. It's just, this is my research is focused there because this is where I find the most interesting rich sources. Also, when I was in my undergrad, I first read in translation the trial records, or not trial record, I guess it's more like an intake record for Eleanor Reichner in class. And that was the first time I'd encountered a trans person from this era. And I was like, oh, this is incredible.
Yeah.
And so that one made me want to find more.
That's excellent. I'm glad you are out there doing that. We need it so badly. Before we get into talking about more trans people in history, which is what we're going to do today, do you want to remind folks where they can find you online after listening?
Sure. So you can find me at nicomara-mckay.com. You can find me on Bluesky at pseudopsyche.nicomara-mckay.com and on Patreon at Ephemeral Record.
Excellent. Go do that. And definitely follow them on Bluesky because you'll see us talking to each other a lot. We have great discussions and you're going to love it. Okay, if you have not listened to episode 79 of this show from last week, Trans History 1, definitely do that first. It's especially important because it talks about how vital it is to name trans people in history when we see them and how our transness has been so often erased. We're going to talk about some key examples of that erasure in just a moment. Let's first look at why there seems to be, quote, so many more trans people now than at any previous point in history. There are two main reasons. One, as our knowledge and understanding of what it means to be transgender increases, more people will realize that they are trans. I've mentioned many times, even in just the episode last week, how I didn't even really know trans was a thing you could be until well into my adulthood. How on earth could I have known I was transgender when I'd never so much as heard the word before, or known there were people like me, trans people who already existed? Yet that didn't change the knowledge I had deep down that I was not a boy and was in fact a girl. This is part of what abhorrent things like quote-unquote don't say gay bills and the banning of queer books are trying to do. If fascists suppress knowledge of our existence, then fewer people know or learn about us, and fewer people can thus identify with us and understand that they may be trans too. But that won't make trans kids any less trans. My own not knowing I could be transgender did not make me any less trans. It just forced me to live in a broken world saddled with the pain and misery of dysphoria, thinking there was no way out. Check out episode 59 on gender dysphoria if you missed it and learn how horrible it was for me to live with it. And if you're thinking what an oppressive, painful, impossible to live through scenario that might be, you're absolutely correct. That's why accepting trans kids when they tell you who they really are is so vital. When 82% of trans people have considered suicide and 40% have attempted it, the numbers are even more dire for trans kids, where 86% of them have considered it and 56%, over half, have attempted it. There's a link in the show notes to that data. And I want to remind you that it is not being trans that makes them suicidal. It's being forced to live a lie and not being supported in being who they truly are that does it. It is literal torture. So, Nico, you talked about this a little bit last week, but were you aware as a kid that trans was something you could be? Like, I know you said that you didn't feel like a boy or a girl, but did you know that that was okay? Or did you have any, I guess, knowledge of non-binary people as a kid?
So I knew it was definitely not okay. Didn't feel like a boy or I was repeatedly impressed upon me in violent ways.
Yeah.
So I don't know how old all of you guys are, but in the early 90s, there was this Saturday Night Live had a sketch called It's Pat, where
oh my God, It's Pat.
Yeah. So that was the closest we came to non-binary representation, was being called an it and being mocked and abused. So I was called Pat a lot.
Oh my God, I'm so
when
sorry.
I was being pushed down the stairs and things like that. So yeah, I had that was my exposure to the closest thing of non-binary identity at the time. Sorry, what was the question? To get back to that part of it.
Yeah, that is. The question was, well, before I get back to that, let me just say that your first experience with a non-binary person being Pat like that is very close to my first experience with seeing what was supposed to be a trans woman in Ace Ventura.
Yeah.
Horrible, absolutely horrible. And we all deserve so much better than that. So, but I guess was the concept. I mean, I guess you've kind of answered it because of Pat, that you knew that you could be non-binary, but if you were...
No, I didn't.
You
Pat
didn't know that?
Pat was something that you were not supposed to want to be.
You could not be that.
And I knew I could not be that. The only trans representation I saw was on shows like Jerry Springer, where you'd have people screaming and saying horrific things. And occasionally you'd have these trans women who could be defiant and powerful in the face of this, but mostly it was just awful. There was no trans mass representation at all. Like Boys Don't Cry didn't come out until 2001 or something. It was or 1999. It was a later film anyway. So after I'd experienced my childhood and most of my teenagehood.
Yeah.
So that was not something even when I first heard the word genderqueer in my 20s, I didn't connect that with being trans. I was like, oh, there's a word for this. But at the time this was like early 2000s, it was very much, you could be trans if you're binary. Non-binary trans was not a thing. Meanwhile, nobody's assigned non-binary at birth, so therefore by default, trans. And again, whether or not people personally identify with trans as a label, that's fine. If they choose not to, I'm not critiquing that. But analytically, as a definition like that, it works. It makes sense. It's just something I had a lot of internalized transphobia as well from these representations from my childhood and from our shared selective media consumption that made this not something that I really understood for myself until later.
Yeah, I had a lot of internalized transphobia to work through too. But like I've talked a little bit before about how, well, I'm attracted to women, and if you're a trans woman, can I call myself a lesbian? I'm trans. I'm not a cis woman. Can I be a lesbian? And it's just, it's horrible what society does to us.
I mean, society just forces the cis binary.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone.
The cis het binary.
Second of the day.
Uh-huh.
Which is why it's so amazing that there's people out there saying, well, kids are being trans because it's cool. I'm like, have you met children? Ever?
So, like,
no, that's...
The abuse you receive doesn't make it cool.
Yeah.
That's not very fun.
Yeah. Like, I'm going to do an essay about this at some point, but like, as a kid, even though I couldn't identify as trans, even though I felt like a girl, right? I didn't think that was a thing I could be. All the cis boys around me knew, right? They couldn't have put a word to it either, but they knew that I wasn't like them. And that was enough to punish me for the hints of femininity that they saw within me. And that was my whole life, just being punished by cis boys for not being like them. And so they know, they absolutely know, even without the word.
Are able to grasp the cis binary, they start enforcing it immediately.
Yeah, yeah. Because they're taught to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're still doing that. It's still happening.
Yeah, okay, all right. We could go on about this all day. Let's get back to talking about trans people in history. Okay. The second reason there seems to be more trans folks now is that as acceptance of transgender people being just another way for a person to be grows, more people feel like they can come out publicly as trans. And I feel like I need to put acceptance in quotes, especially given the current climate. Again, if you're wondering if part of the onslaught of legislation trying to squash trans people out of existence plays into this, you're absolutely right. It does. If bigotry against us is accepted, and in many parts of society it is, even in quote-unquote liberal places, more trans people will be scared to come out. See the Trans Tuesday on Trans Rage 2, Cis Apathy at TillysTransTuesdays.com. Time and again, we see evidence that trans people are a group it's quote-unquote okay to discriminate against. Even in good old quote-unquote liberal Hollywood, you can be an active, bigoted transphobe and get rewarded for it.
And liberal Hollywood doesn't exist. That's just a big lie. I laugh every time someone uses it.
A social media post I made reads, "Trans people remain the only group it's okay to hate. How do you look at these nominees and not think trans people are completely unwanted? 3 of 5 nominees are known for their transphobia. One in the special itself, and the TV Academy was like, goodbye us, heartbroken." And that included an image for the Outstanding Variety Special Pre-Recorded category in the 2022 Emmy Awards, showing the nominees were Adele, One Night Only, she's fine, Dave Chappelle, The Closer, not fine, Harry Potter, not fine, Norm Macdonald, Nothing Special, not fine, and one last time, Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga, fine. The fascists came for us, and cis people as a group did not care. Still don't. Bigotry against us is accepted. The collective cis population doesn't show up for us, doesn't care that our bodily autonomy is being taken away. Look at people like Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais and J.K. Rowling making money off of punching down and adding to the oppression and bigotry against us, and they keep getting more work. All of this adds to making some trans people feel like it's too painful, too difficult, too risky to come out. And despite all of this, this is still, somehow, the most accepting that our society has ever been to trans people. Well, there might have been a time in the 2010s when knowledge and acceptance was growing and before we became fascist Republicans' latest target where it felt safer. And so our numbers seemed to rise, and now we see the target on our back growing. My favorite example of this is the lovely chart of the percentage of the population over time that is left-handed, which you can see in the text version of this topic. There's a graph showing the history of left-handedness, the rate of left-handedness among Americans by year of birth, showing it at 5% in the late 1800s, dipping down to just above 3% in the early 1900s, and then steadily rising until 1960, where it tapers off at 12% and remains there through the year 2000. Being left-handed is just like being trans or cis or gay or straight. We have no control over it, it's just how we are. So what happened between 1910 and 1960 to make so many more people become left-handed? As you know, nothing makes people become left-handed, but being left-handed was discriminated against and thought to be quote-unquote evil. Ring any bells? For a long time in history, there's a link in the show notes. Once the general population realized how utterly wrong that was, more people came out as left-handed once it was safe to do so. Who would have thunk?
Really funny to think about coming out of the closet as left-handed. This was a
Yeah,
process
right?
people had to go through.
It was. You had to come out. Well, I'm left-handed. It was it's so weird.
I mean, yeah, my brother's left-handed.
Yeah.
Definitely they tried to force him to be right-handed.
Really?
Sure.
Because that was not even back in the 1960s. Now we're talking, no, wow.
But like, if you think about it, it's like, it's inconvenient. I don't have scissors for you. I have right-handed scissors. It's a problem.
A quote-unquote problem.
Exactly. That I need to solve.
Parallel with transness too. You being trans is inconvenient for me. This person who has to gender you correctly, and
right.
or you could just be a person.
Right. Oh my gosh. Okay.
I've like shared tips with people, like put the pronouns in your phone when you text them, and then you're gonna see them.
Then it will remind you. You can do it.
And do it for everyone.
People.
The other
just
part.
do it for everybody.
Do it for everybody.
Do it for everyone.
I mean, that's what I did.
Yeah.
I did it by me right away into your phone so I could get you.
And you never got it wrong. You did what was needed. And
I mean, I'm sure I got it wrong.
You never did.
No.
Not to me, which was what mattered.
That's all, I guess.
Being trans due to our society or personal reasons is also something that can take some people a long time to figure out. Coupled with both of the instances above is why estimates of how much the trans population are severely undercounted. Present U.S. Census data puts us at about 1 to 2% of the population. But that's only the people out as trans or who know they're trans and also feel safe reporting that information on census data. When you account for all the above barriers to our existence and coming out, it's going to be much higher, which seems to be happening with Gen Z and how many of them say they are not cisgender. If I had to guess, I'd probably put the total trans and non-binary part of the population at around 10%, but we're never going to truly know that number without a fully trans-accepting society. So due to lack of knowledge or terminology and lack of acceptance, both societal and self-acceptance, spotting trans people in history isn't always cut and dry. Sometimes we have to infer things from context clues. And did you know one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of knowledge of trans people in the past, or the reason people in the past didn't have the terminology, is because information about us was routinely destroyed, suppressed, or outright intentionally misinterpreted? Magnus Hirschfeld had one of the largest and most extensive collections of books and information and research on trans people. He ran a clinic that helped trans women transition in Germany pre-World War II. And guess, can you guess what one of the Nazis' earliest targets was? Do you understand that the rising transphobia and violence in the U.S. from fascists is history repeating itself? Link in the show notes. Queer and trans people were targeted and forced into concentration camps by the Nazis and are often forgotten about or intentionally left out of the discussion entirely. There's multiple links in the show notes about this too. Good thing the Allies freed everyone who was still alive in the camps, except did you know that they didn't? They left the queer people in the camps and freed everyone else. How horrified does that make you? Here's a quote from thepinktriangle.com. At the end of the war, when the concentration camps were finally liberated, virtually all of the prisoners were released except those who wore the pink triangle. Many of those with the pink triangle on their pocket were put back in prison and their nightmare continued. And there's been active erasure of trans people in the camps, with them being reported falsely as members of their gender assigned at birth. Quote, earlier histories tended to misgender trans women, labeling them as men. This is odd given that when you read the records of their police interrogations, they are often remarkably clear about their gender identity, even though they were not helping their cases at all by doing so. Again, link in the show notes. Did you know that? Are you appalled that even the quote-unquote good guys aren't on our side? Are you starting to get the truth of the situation? Welcome to the club. There's a good Twitter thread about the willful ignoring or hiding of trans people in history linked in the show notes. I know Twitter is horrible, but this thread is still there and it's fabulous, so please check it out. In spite of all that's stacked against us, trans people have still always existed, always persisted. So let's look at some examples of trans people in history. Again, for many we have to use context clues, but you'll see it's pretty clear when you pay attention. There are links in the show notes to learn more about all of these fabulous trans people I'm going to tell you about. So just know that, all of them. There's going to be so many links. You should go check them out. Further touching on the topic of erasure of the trans people in history, which I talked about extensively last week as an issue that plagues historians, here's a prime example with one of my favorite trans people in history, and oh god, this name always gets me. Okay, here we go. Charles Genevieve Louis Auguste Andre Timothée de Aon de Beaumont. I hope I got that right. She's a trans woman who used brilliance and trickery to get transphobic society to declare her legally a woman by making everyone think she was assigned female at birth and a trans man. Genius, a hero, we stan a queen. And if you want another example of how despite all of that evidence, people will go out of their way to say she wasn't actually a trans woman, look at this excerpt from a book about her. Monsieur de Aon is a Woman by Gary Cates, from the preface to the Johns Hopkins paperback edition. Alina Boyden on Twitter gets credit for introducing me to this prime example of shit gone wrong. The Chevalier de Aon changed my own ideas about gender. I never thought it possible for an 18th century person to alter the fundamental ways that I view gender roles and gender theory. But he did. I don't mean that I cross-dress today or live as a woman, but I certainly admire those who do, such as the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey. For de Aon, I was a feminist in the sense that I hoped the avenues to power, wealth, and independence once monopolized by men could be extended to women. I married a physician and applauded myself that I was liberal enough to allow her to act like a man. Oh, God. But de Aon was not a feminist in this sense. He did not simply think that the opportunities accorded to men should be extended to women. He believed that men should live as women. At first, I thought de Aon must have been Europe's first transsexual, the victim of a disorder that certain psychiatrists label gender dysphoria. I assumed that today he would have been a prime candidate for sex reassignment surgery. Indeed, since the 1920s, communities of transsexuals and transvestites have thought of de Aon as their patron saint. However, several conversations with a psychiatrist who had worked in gender identity clinic convinced me that de Aon was not sick. He did not hate himself. He did not hate his body. He did not think that he was trapped in the wrong body. But if de Aon was not a transsexual, then, well, what was he? Of course, my book argues that de Aon came to a cognitive decision that it was best for him to live life as a woman. And obviously, as a historian, I became convinced of this argument through reading the archival records that remain today in Paris, London, Tonnerre, and especially at the University of Leeds. Oh my God, who says you get to decide, bub? She didn't seem sick enough? What the shit? That is such a transmedicalist view. You don't have to have gender dysphoria to be trans. Listen to episode 59 on transmedicalism and WPATH version 1 for more on that.
This was published in 2001.
Yeah, right?
Sorry, this is not, written in 1980. That's like...
Right, yeah. This century it was written. Oh my God. Okay. Yeah. Here's another passage still from the preface. Oh, it drives me mad. As I grew up in the same 1950s Los Angeles as Virginia Prince, I was aware that I could become Catholic or even French, that I could take on various roles, identities, sexual orientations, and occupations, but it was clear that I must never seem like a woman. Gay was fine, but woman was the other, that which I was not. I figured that folks who moved across gender boundaries were sick. De Aon's autobiographical memoirs and essays, filtered through experiences such as the interview with Virginia Prince, taught me that my own upbringing had been narrow and prejudiced insofar as it never gave me the opportunity to express myself as a woman. He's so close. Oh, that such a statement feels bizarre and comical to express makes it no less true. The Chevalier taught me, a late 20th century man, that my refusal to consider womanhood is bigotry, my hang-up. However liberal I think I am, whatever kind of 1970s feminist I think I have become, the story of this man's chutzpah makes me aware of what is possible for all men. One of the most important decisions I made writing my book was using the pronoun he for de Aon, which continually reminds readers of de Aon's anatomy, ignoring linguistically his self-fashioning. I would never refer to Virginia Prince as quote-unquote he, and indeed neither would anyone else who respects members of the transgendered community. But writing about de Aon is different. Here I felt that I was speaking as a man to other imagined male readers about the choices that were in front of all of us. Look at this cis dude, patting himself on the back for being so open-minded while ignoring what trans people tell him. So sure that he knows better. Look at him choosing to ignore de Aon's pronouns because he felt that de Aon had a penis and thus had to be a man, and he wanted to claim what de Aon did for cis men. claim being trans for cis men without calling yourself trans. Like, just what the actual hell? Oh, it is so maddening to see things like this, abundantly clear examples of transness in history, and see cis people still say, no, cis person behaving in ways no cis person does because reasons, I guess.
So like third wave feminism here, he's still in like 1970s feminism. Like
he's
this is
so
his, like,
far behind.
Point.
Like, where do you see that? Like, I've always run into this with especially cis white men, where it's like everything has to be about them and for them, and things that even clearly aren't. They twist so much to make it about them, and it's just so baffling to me. I've never felt the compulsion to do that, and I don't know why they would. I mean, like,
and also twist things to make sure they fit into the cisgender hetero.
Yeah, right.
When it's clear that seems weird, man.
And like we talked about
literally telling you they're not.
Yeah, and like we talked about last week, where they say trans people trying to find trans people in history is some manifesto with an agenda. Like, this dude has an agenda. Here's a very clearly trans woman that you are being like, no, that was a guy, because I want to be like that guy, but I'm not trans, so that guy wasn't trans, even though it was clearly a trans woman. Oh my God, it drives me mad.
That's the cis agenda right there. You've named it perfectly.
Yeah, that's that. Okay. Getting all worked up. All right. Whether through ignorance or malicious intent, Gary Cates chose to erase DeEon's transness from history.
Not DeEon.
Deon? I'm not French. Help me, Nico. How would you pronounce that? Deon? Deon. Oh, yes, I had 2 years of... Oh, I'm a bad French student. Deon. Sorry to all the French people listening. Please forgive me. I'm so American. Okay. Whether through ignorance or malicious intent, Gary Cates chose to erase Deon's transness from history. This is what we're up against. This is what we have to work to undo. And so let's get to work undoing. If we're talking about trans people in history, we absolutely have to mention Marsha P. Johnson, 1945 to 1992, an activist who was at Stonewall and was forever leading the charge for queer rights in the U.S. I hope you're already familiar with her. She's an icon and utterly vital. One famous example you've heard of and probably had no idea was trans, the author of Little Women, Lou Alcott, 1832 to 1888. Despite not having the terminology to identify as transgender at the time, look at the evidence in the show notes and try and tell me that Lou was not transgender. Then there's Mark and David Farrow, two trans brothers in the 1930s who had the support of their parents, which seems like a miracle when that happens today. And if that happened in the 30s, that is extraordinary. And they transitioned in their teens. There's the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, 1910 to 1985, a priest, activist, and a non-binary, gender-fluid, potentially intersex icon. Again, as they did not have the terminology, we cannot be exactly sure how they would identify today or what pronouns they would use, but it's very clear they were not cisgender. There's Lucy Hicks Anderson, 1886 to 1954, a trans woman who was a philanthropist and activist and ran a bordello. She was cooler than I will ever be. There's Roberta Cowell, 1918 to 2011, a trans woman race car driver and fighter pilot, also so much cooler than I will ever be. You've hopefully heard of Wendy Carlos, born in 1939, the film composer who did the scores to A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, and Tron. She also worked with Weird Al, and okay, every trans person in history is cooler than I will ever be. I've got to step up my game. There's a paper linked in the show notes, The Trans Middle Ages, incorporating transgender and intersex studies into the history of medieval sexuality. And did you know there is compelling evidence that Kurt Cobain was trans? True facts. There's also an article with a lot of lovely photos about Casa Susana, a secret house of trans women in the 1960s. There's also a PBS documentary about it. Or how about checking out an article about Dr. Alan L. Hart, 1890 to 1962, a trans man who saved so many lives because he pioneered detecting tuberculosis with x-rays, all while the world was repeatedly unkind to him. Even BuzzFeed, of all places, has done an article on trans people in history. Okay, these are all still fairly recent. I hear you annoyingly saying, can you go back further? Sure, I found a lovely article about trans people in the Old West. You may have even heard the big news about Roman Emperor Elagabalus 204 to 222 being a trans woman. And I also want to mention a very cool Bluesky thread that Nico did. It is about Anastasios, a trans man monk in the 6th century whose gender was affirmed after his death. And Nico, I want to ask you, how did you find him? How did you unearth that information about him? It was so cool.
Oh, well, I read about him in Roland Betancourt's Byzantine Intersectionality. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend people check out. I can give a brief summary of the story if that's
please do.
Sure. So this story appears in a saint's life, and saints' lives were collected and shared in order to provide models of ideal Christian devotion and service. And so in the life of Anastasios from the late 6th century, a woman fled the attentions of Emperor Constantine and the anger of Empress Theodora, and asked the Abba Daniel of Thetis for a monk's cell. So Daniel clothed him and kept his secret for 28 years. On Anastasios' deathbed, he asked that he remain clothed at his burial so that others may not learn his secret. Normally, bodies would be washed and dressed for burial. So he asked that sort of not happen so people couldn't find out the gender he was assigned. So after his death, Daniel took the garment off that he himself was wearing and placed it on the dead man. And Daniel's disciple tended to the body, and he saw on his chest that he had what is quoted as saying women's breasts, looking like two shriveled up leaves. And so after the funeral service, the disciple asked if Daniel had known that the eunuch that they had buried was a woman. Daniel said that he knew, but also affirmed the gender of, quote, his father and brother Anastasios, the eunuch, as male. So his dignity and gender were preserved in his death by the abbot of that monastery, which is quite nice.
It's so beautiful that, even in these highly restrictive times, there are good people that will, respect you for who you are, even when you're gone. And I mean, that touched me so much because so many trans people get disrespected in death. Like we just mentioned talking last week at one of the excerpts I read about how often trans people get misgendered in their obituaries. And so something like that amount of respect, it touches me so deeply, and I find it really moving.
It's actually like a common pattern in a lot of these religious transmasculine narratives where a person who's designated female at birth flees unwanted male sexual attention, clothes and grooves themselves after a masculine fashion, joins a monastery, and then lives a holy life until they're discovered, and then that becomes an issue. But and this has a nice ending.
Yeah, it sure did. It's good we have happy endings. Sometimes we need those.
Mm-hmm.
In the show notes, there is a link to a video about Scythian transgender priestesses from thousands of years ago who may have used urine from pregnant mares, which is high in estrogen, for hormone replacement therapy for trans women. This is actually what old estrogen pills for HRT were actually made from, and why it was called Premarin. PRE from pregnant, MAR from mare, and IN from urine. In the show notes, you can read about Sumerian goddess Inanna, who regularly had transgender priestesses back in at least 4000 BC, if not even earlier. Inanna was also known for turning men into women. We love a transgender affirming goddess.
So there's like a couple other people I can add to this. Eleanor Riker, who I've mentioned briefly a couple of times. So Ruth Mazzucaris and David Lorenzo Boyd in 1995 recovered this record of a person who was named Eleanor Reichner. The records call her John calling herself Eleanor Reichner in the sort of the introduction to the case. And in 1995, when Karas and Boyd first read this, they interpreted it as a transvestite man, was how it was read, even though Eleanor in this record that talks about how because they were, the person who interviewed her was like baffled by what they were seeing. In December 1395, two people were brought before the Mayor and Alderman of London. So one of these was Eleanor Reichner, who was wearing women's clothing, and the other was John Britby, whose clothing went unremarked upon. These two were recently found in the record, what the record describes as that detestable, unmentionable, and ignominious vice. The unmentionable vice alluded to is likely sodomy, which had a broader meaning in medieval Europe than it does today, and include any non-procreative sex between partners of any gender, including oral sex, intercurrent sex, and so on. The record states that Britby solicited sex from Reichner, and Reichner agreed as long as she was paid. They were then discovered by city officials and taken to prison. Days later, Reichner appeared before the mayor and aldermen in women's clothing and confirmed the account along with Britby. So the record of the investigation concerning each party focuses on different aspects of their encounter. Reichner was interrogated about who taught her this practice, and she gave an account of her social transition. She also provided a long list of sexual partners who she had sex with as both a woman and a man. These included students, priests, nuns, women, and men, both married and not. And Reichner's testimony described her introduction to sex work and previous careers as a seamstress in Oxford and a bartender. Rigby's testimony, on the other hand, centered on the fact that he engaged Reichner for sex with the understanding that she was a woman, insisting that he didn't realize that the relations might constitute the unnamed sin of sodomy. So records of the outcome of the case, if they existed, don't appear to have survived. And it's important to note as well, like the case was originally recorded in Latin and that the pronouns used for Reichner split between the masculine and feminine and common. And so how historians have subsequently represented the case is therefore a matter of choice of translation into English in our case. So I mentioned Karras and Boyd in 1995 reading this case as one of a transvestite man. That was sort of the language that was not uncommon in 1995. So it is kind of appropriate to the period, in a sense. Although the man part you might want to question.
Yeah.
A later article by Karras with Tom Lincoln in 2016 instead suggests that Reichner was transgender, and they proposed the term transgender-like for people who can't necessarily define as transgender prior to the term coined and all the stuff that we talked about in the last episode. And the adjective transgender-like plays on Judith Bennett's lesbian-like, which was intended to serve the same sort of function. So people who couldn't be labeled as lesbian because that cultural identity didn't exist, but who still engaged in same-sex practices with women. So there's sort of like an evolution of thinking between this, like between the 20 years between when this was first read by them and in the subsequent publications of how it's been interpreted. And now Eleanor Reichner is like recognized just straightforwardly, I think, as a trans woman by pretty much all historians. Like, I don't know that, I mean, there's probably some bigoted people who would still read it.
There always seem to be, right?
But I think the majority opinion is that, yes, this is a clear case of a transgender woman expressing that she is trans or expressing that she is a woman and that she wears feminine clothing, that she was taught how to be a woman by someone. Like, all of this is sort of recorded in this record, which is not only like 2 pages long, it's quite brief. But you still get this huge wealth of information about who she was and what her life was like.
Yeah.
In this brief snapshot. There's also Katharina Hetzeldorfer in 1477. Helmut Puff uncovered this case and published an article in the year 2000. And so we only know the name Katharina Hetzeldorfer, but presumably he would have had a masculine name. It just did not get recorded. And he was picked up for his sexual advances on women that were quite forceful, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
And, well, he was very enthusiastic. And this was not received well after some time. And but anyway, the case was read as a case of female sodomy rather than the suggestion that Hetzeldorfer was a man, despite the fact that he presented as a man, dressed as a man, and had a wife. And like, there's a very detailed account of the phallus that he created and used, that he used for both sexual reasons and to urinate with. So it seems pretty unambiguous to me that this is a case of a trans man.
Yeah.
But that's not how it was read in the record by historians or by his contemporaries when he lived and when the trial records take place.
Yeah, somehow it reminds me a little bit of, for folks that, if you check out the show links or the show notes, the links there about the link about trans people in the Old West, because I believe it was in there that there was this one trans man, lived as a man his whole life, and occasionally would experience transphobia or people calling out that he wasn't really a man, and he simply shot and killed them all. Anybody who intimated he was not a man, he shot. And I love that for him. What a king. So not that I'm advocating shooting people, but I'm just like, talk about being secure in your identity. Like, no, that's amazing. So
this could happen more than once, suggests that he didn't go to prison? Like, what? I have to learn more about this. Thank you for bringing this to my attention.
He's amazing. So definitely check that out.
There?
Yeah, I don't know, but well, in the Old West, people were shooting people all the time. So
it's a popular hobby. If you didn't have internet,
they didn't have anything else to do. So yeah, okay. I want to close with another of my favorites, medieval French philosopher Colonimus ben Colonimus, 1286 to 1328. Credit to Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg for first bringing Colonimus to my attention. This is the second time I've mentioned the rabbi in a Trans Tuesday, and she's cis, that is peak allyship. This translation of Colonimus's poem touched me so deeply, it moved me. I can feel her pain. I know her pain. I hope you read all the links in the show notes, but absolutely you must read this. And I'm going to read it out here and hope that I can get through it without sobbing. There are some notes from the translator that I've left in explaining what she meant by certain words at the time. What an awful fate for my mother, that she bore a son. What a loss of all benefit. Cursed be the one who announced to my father, it's a boy. Woe to him who has male sons, upon them a heavy yoke has been placed, restrictions and constraints, some in private, some in public, some to avoid the mere appearance of violation, and some entering the most secret of places. Strong statutes and awesome commandments. 613. Who is the man who can do all that is written so that he might be spared? Oh, but had the artisan who made me created me instead a fair woman. Today I would be wise and insightful. We would weave, my friends and I, and in the moonlight spin our yarn, and tell our stories to one another from dusk till midnight. We tell of the events of our day, silly things, matters of no consequence, but also I would grow very wise from spinning, and I would say, happy is she who knows how to work with combed flax and weave it into fine white linen. And at times, in the way of women, I would lie down on the kitchen floor between the ovens, turn the coals, and taste the different dishes. On holidays, I would put on my best jewelry. I would beat on the drum, and my clapping hands would ring. And when I was ready, and the time was right, an excellent youth, husband, would be my fortune. He would love me, place me on a pedestal, dress me in jewels of gold, earrings, bracelets, necklaces. And on the appointed day, in the season of joy when brides are wed, for 7 days would the boy increase my delight and gladness. Were I hungry, he would feed me well-needed bread. Were I thirsty, he would quench me with light and dark wine. He would not chastise nor harshly treat me, and my sexual pleasure he would not diminish. Every Shabbat and each new moon, his head would rest upon my breast. The 3 husbandly duties he would fulfill, rations, raiment, and regular intimacy. And 3 wifely duties I would also fulfill, watching for menstrual, blood, Sabbath candle, lights, and bread. Father in heaven, who did miracles for our ancestors with fire and water, you changed the fire of Chaldees so it would not burn hot. You changed Dinah in the womb of her mother to a girl. You changed the staff to a snake before 1,000,000 eyes. You changed Moses' hand to leprous white, and the sea to dry land. In the desert you turned rock to water, hard flint to a fountain. Who would then turn me from a man to a woman? Were I only to have merited this, being so graced by goodness? What shall I say? Why cry or be bitter? If my Father in heaven has decreed upon me, and has maimed me with an immutable deformity, then I do not wish to remove it. The sorrow of the impossible is a human pain that nothing will cure, and for which no comfort can be found. So I will bear and suffer until I die and wither in the ground. Since I have learned from our tradition that we bless both the good and the bitter, I will bless in a voice hushed and weak. Blessed are you, God, who has not made me a woman. Translated by Rabbi Steve Greenberg. Oh, I got a little choked up at the end. That is the agony, the despair, the longing of gender dysphoria. How can anyone read that and not say Kalonymus Ben Kalonymus living in the 1200s was anything other than a transgender woman? The only way is if you're actively trying to suppress the knowledge that we have indeed always existed, and being trans is just a normal part of life and the way some people happen to be. Thanks for being here, Nico.
Thank you for having me.
The list of historical trans people mentioned in this episode is not exhaustive. There's so many more, but hopefully this gets you started on looking for more examples on your own. And when you find them, share them with the world. We need to know, trans and cis alike. All you have to do is pay attention. We've always been here and always will be. This is who we are. Tilly Bridges, end transmission. Tilly's Trans Tuesdays is hosted by Tilly Bridges and Susan Bridges with audio editing and sound mixing by Jillian Morgan. The Google Doc and social media versions of this week's topic and all past topics are available at Tilly'sTransTuesdays.com. Special thanks to Daisy and Jane for the use of Sorry Not Sorry as our show's theme music. Please stop by and show your support at daisyandjane.bandcamp.com and soundcloud.com/daisyandjane. You can find me at Tilly Bridges on Bluesky, Twitter, and Hive, on Mastodon at tillybridges at mastodon.social, at facebook.com/TillySBridges, and on Insta and Threads at Heck Yeah Tilly Bridges. And you can find Susan on most of those at Susan L. Bridges. You can find Jillian at Audio Jillian on Bluesky. You can join the Tillyverse Discord server by following the link at the very bottom of TillysTransTuesdays.com. We hold regular watch parties for the Matrix films and other trans movies where I do a live Q&A, and it's blossomed into a wonderfully supportive, compassionate, kind community of friends. We'd love to have you join us. For more information, visit pendantaudio.com. Thanks for listening. Oh dear, I should have practiced these names. Elagabalus, 204 to 22. No, my God, we're okay.